The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
In the maelstrom of information unleashed during the pandemic and now amidst war, an old phenomenon seems to have found fertile ground. Tonight, how conspiracy theories and disinformation have attracted new audiences here in Canada. First up, can Western sanctions on the so-called Russian oligarchs influence Putin or the direction of the war in Ukraine? We'll examine that too. It's Wednesday, March the 9th, and that's next on The Agenda. Russian billionaires with assets parked around the world got very rich with Russian President Vladimir Putin in power. But they also found themselves the focus of intense international scrutiny when Russia opted to invade Ukraine. With us now on where these so-called oligarchs fit into the economic and political power structures in their home country and beyond, let's welcome, in London, UK, Bill Browder, CEO of Hermitage Capital and head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign, whose forthcoming book is Freezing Order, a true story of money laundering, murder, and surviving Vladimir Putin's wrath. On Manhattan Island in New York City, Alexander Cooley, professor of political science at Columbia University and co-author of Dictators Without Borders. And in Montreal, Quebec, Christy Ironside, assistant professor of Russian history at McGill University and author of A Full Value Ruble. And as I welcome all of you to the program, it's good to see you all again. I want to set up our discussion with this quote from the Washington Post from an article of a few years back. Here we go. In modern Russia, wealthy business executives hold much less influence over the state. They own Russia, but they do not rule it. In fact, they are well aware that their own fortunes can be taken away by the state with little notice. Bill, start us off. How would you characterize the relationship between Putin's government and the oligarchs?
I would say that I wouldn't even talk about Putin's government. Vladimir Putin controls the oligarchs. They exist at his pleasure. So at any point, if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, they can have their money taken away, they can be imprisoned, or they can be killed. And when I mean in terms of what they need to do in order to satisfy Vladimir Putin, the first thing is that they need to be custodians for his wealth. And so when you look at an oligarch offshore and you say they have $20 billion, that's not all theirs. 10 of it belongs to Vladimir Putin. And so these people play a very important role for Vladimir Putin, which is the custodian of his offshore wealth. And they also do whatever they're asked to do when they're asked to do it.
Christy, could you follow up on that? Because I think we need to better understand how it is that if they're holding on to so much of his money, how is it he has so much control over them rather than vice versa?
I mean, these are people who were the old political elites coming out of the Soviet Union in some ways, and they made their money because of this. They were the people who were well poised to take advantage of Russia's capitalist transition. They made their money in a lot of underhanded ways, and they know this on some level, right? So I would agree that they are able to maintain this wealth at his leisure. They are not people who, I mean, they've been hedging against this in many ways. They've got second passports and things like that, but their position is entirely dependent upon staying in the good graces of the government.
Alexander, is that also the case for those who don't even live inside Russia?
Yeah, it's especially so. So for a while, we thought that this phenomenon of seeing the oligarchs go to places like the UK, founding Londongrad, and there were arguments made that interactions with the system of law, with the stock market, with boards of directors, with philanthropic circles and giving would somehow socialize them. Somehow it would tame them, make them more liberal. What we've seen is it's the exact opposite, that this idea that somehow integration with the West would make them more Western has proven a false hope.
Bill, let's do a little history here, in as much as we're going back more than 3 decades now to the collapse of the Soviet Union. How was it that so few people, we're talking about 118 Russian billionaires, were able to amass so much wealth so quickly as the country was sort of disintegrating from what it was and turning into what it's become?
Well, Russia is has the most inequality, the most concentrated wealth of any country in the world. And that comes from this what they called mass privatization. The original idea was in order to go from communism to capitalism, the Soviet government, well, I guess the Russian government right after the Soviet Union collapsed, would give away all property, quote, to the people for free. And that was the idea. But then you had these, and at the time it was a number much lower than 118. There were 22 oligarchs who basically, through very sharp elbows, very violent demeanor, and very close connections with the president at the time, Boris Yeltsin, were able to commandeer at the time about 40% of the GDP of Russia under their control. And it was all sort of total cowboy capitalism. The average Russian got nothing, literally nothing. And it was a terrible, terrible time. And the thought was, when Putin came to power, that he would somehow end this. But instead, Vladimir Putin became the biggest oligarch himself, and then made sure that a few of his friends and underlings and others joined the ranks of the oligarchs to get you to this 118 number you just quoted.
And that quote comes from Forbes magazine from an article last year, that 118 number. Bill, to follow up to you, though, do you think that the frustration of essentially this small group of people looting the treasury, if you like, at the expense of all of the other Russian citizens, do you think that in some way helped pave the way for Putin?
Well, I think for sure. So in my mind, Vladimir Putin is the richest man in the world based on everything I've seen. I think that he owns half of the assets that belong to the oligarchs. And I believe that all that money that was stolen by him and by the oligarchs is effectively the money that should have been spent on the Russian people. And the longer the Russian people haven't gotten that money, and the more unfair and unequal things have gotten, the more scared Putin has become of being overthrown. And the more scared he's become of being overthrown has led to more repression and more foreign military adventures. And it's culminated with where we are right now.
All right, so Christy, he's absolutely stinking rich, but the next question is, can he actually get his hands on that money whenever he wants?
Well, right now, this is the big question, because they developed these massive foreign currency reserves, in part because they were anticipating sanctions were going to affect the economy, which has been sanctioned since 2014. But now a lot of those assets are inaccessible to them, right? They've been frozen. Some of it is in gold, which is quite hard to convert. Some of it is in Chinese currency, and for now, China hasn't really intervened in this conflict. They have not participated in the sanctions, but they certainly can't get access to all of it. That's for sure.
All right, Alex, we just heard from Bill that it was actually under Boris Yeltsin that this sort of kleptocracy began. When Putin went into power, what changed for Russia's oligarchs at that point?
Well, the nature of the bargain was clarified. What we saw in Putin was the full deployment of state power, first with the war in Chechnya, to demonstrate that all underlings would be brought to heel, that the integrity of the state would be prized above everything. And then we saw also the confluence of higher rising commodity prices meant that the Russian government received more and more revenues. As it received more and more revenues, it became more assertive. It demanded that loyalty be maintained to the state. It brought to heel individuals like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who had tried to plow an independent pathway. And so as Russia became richer, Putin became more powerful and also had the support of what was then a growing Russian middle class that actually felt a material improvement in their circumstances and their ability to consume.
Bill, maybe you could pick up the story there, the reference to Khodorkovsky. What happens if you're an oligarch and you don't play by Putin's rules?
Well, this is the sort of classic story. So Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the richest man in Russia. This was pre-2003. He owned an oil company called Yukos. And his plan was to sort of westernize Yukos, bring on Western directors, Western transparency. And he also started to criticize Putin openly. And in retaliation, Putin arrested him on his private jet in Siberia, brought him back to Moscow, put him on trial. And when you go on trial in Russia, there's a 99.7% conviction rate. And so there's no presumption of innocence, so they just put you in a cage. And so they put him in a cage, and they allowed the television cameras to come into the courtroom and film the richest man in Russia on trial sitting in a cage. And the purpose of this wasn't just to punish Khodorkovsky, it was to send a message to every other oligarch in Russia that if you stand up to me, if you try to engage with the West in the way that he was doing, that you will end up with nothing. And so at the end, all the oligarchs, they went to him and they said, Vladimir, we definitely don't want to sit in that cage. And what else do we have to do? And he said, 50%. And not 50% for the Russian government or 50% for the presidential administration of Russia, but 50% for Vladimir Putin. And that was the deal with the devil that Vladimir Putin did with each of these people. And he became this unbelievably wealthy man. And as a result of this wealth, he's kind of backed himself into this terrible corner, because it's not as if he can ever retire from presidency. The money that he has extorted from these people and the other crimes that he's committed means that he's got to be president. The moment he's not president, he'll go to jail, he'll lose his money, and he may even die. And so for Putin, this has created this terrible situation where he has to stay in power until the end of his natural life. And the longer he's there, the more challenges are there and the more difficult it is. And that's kind of how I think we've escalated into this unbelievable situation.
Let me do a quick follow-up with you, Bill, because, and again, I don't want you to give up sources or methods here or anything like that. However, that 50% story, how do you know that?
It's common knowledge. It's not a well-kept secret. There's lots of people in Russia who would repeat that story. And it can also be proven anecdotally by various leaks that have come out of Russia since then. So, for example, Alexei Navalny, the famous opposition activist that Putin tried to kill, who's currently in jail, he did an investigation into Putin's $1.3 billion palace on the Black Sea. And as part of his investigation, he learned that many hundreds of millions of dollars were transferred by certain oligarchs to pay for that, very much as part of like Putin drawing on his reserves with those oligarchs in order to fund his house. Many other stories like that. It's just a well-known situation in Russia, and anybody who's connected to the elite of Russia will have heard this many times.
Gotcha. Christy, I don't want to be ridiculously picky here, but we call these folks oligarchs, and yet if you look up oligarchy in the dictionary, it says rule by a small elite. And we've already learned here today that these folks don't actually rule. They depend on, but they don't rule. So are we mislabeling them?
It's a really good question. I think my historian reaction to that would be to say that Russia has a long history of the service state. This idea that you have a group of nobles, a group of high-ranking people who serve the Tsar, who serve at the Tsar's leisure. And so in some ways we see oligarchy, but we also see a longer tradition of there being a small kind of group of people who have their rights and privileges. And historically with the aristocracy, it was land, but now it's wealth. So there's a longer tradition of this in Russian history.
Alex, I'm going to quote something that you wrote a few years ago in the Journal of Democracy, and then we'll come back and chat. Globalization, you wrote, enables grand corruption as well as the laundering of kleptocrats' finances and reputations. Shell companies and new forms of international investment, such as luxury real estate purchases, serve to launder the ill-gotten gains of kleptocrats. Critically, this normalization of, quote, everyday kleptocracy depends heavily on transnational professional intermediaries. Western public relations agents, lobbyists, and lawyers help to recast kleptocrats as internationally respected business people and philanthropic cosmopolitans. Are we, I want to make sure I understand what you're saying here, are we in the West somewhat culpable in all of this drama that's unfolding now?
Steve, 100% we're part of this transnational network that has enabled grand kleptocracy. We typically have this idea of dividing the world up into clean countries and corrupt countries, right? And we pride ourselves at being at the top of, say, that Transparency International Anti-Corruption Index. But the truth of the matter is transnational kleptocracy requires all sorts of global service providers. If you are a kleptocrat and you have stolen money from your host country, the number one thing you want to do is make that money safe for the rainy day in which you're no longer in power or have access to power and everything can be taken away. So what do you need to do? You need to take that money and put it into an economic system that has rule of law and respects your property rights. So that means bank accounts, it means real estate, it means a whole network of service providers who are not only going to take care of your cash, but also recast you and your reputation from being that of a compromised political elite to being a respectable global philanthropist, cultural patron, university patron. And that's the other part of this reputation laundering. We in the West lead at providing these services.
Well, okay, Bill, what do you do if you're an art gallery and you need money to go along and you've got some oligarch who's prepared to write you a $50 million check? You supposed to turn it down?
Well, I think that a lot of them are ruining the day that they took those $50 million checks right now. It's, I mean, if Pablo Escobar came along and wrote you a $50 million check, would you take it? And of course not. You know, if the Iranian mullahs wrote you a $50 million check, would you take it? No. And so, I mean, you couldn't have described the world situation better than that. You know, this whole enabler thing that you've just described. It's just exactly what's happened, and we have this whole class of Western enablers that have created this situation for the oligarchs, and it doesn't just corrupt our system and allow it and make us take dirty money, but it puts Putin in this very strong position vis-a-vis the West, where for the last 20 years nobody wanted to rock the boat. Everyone wanted this money to continue flowing. And as a result, when Putin did terrible things like invading Georgia and taking Crimea and shooting down passenger planes and carpet bombing Syria, nobody wanted to say anything because everyone was so happy with the status quo. Everyone wanted to just keep the system running the way it was running because so many Westerners had paved the way and legitimized these Russians to such an extent that that they just wanted it to keep on going.
Well, Christy, we haven't mentioned sports franchises, for example. There have been Russian oligarchs who have purchased soccer teams, hockey teams, professional soccer and hockey teams. Again, you know, these leagues are always looking for incredibly rich people to help buy their franchises, improve the value of their franchises. Are they supposed to shut the door on them?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, we've seen in the last week, Roman Abramovich has said that he's going to divest from Chelsea and he's going to potentially give the money to victims of the war in Ukraine. He hasn't quite specified what he means by that yet, whether that's going to Ukrainians or also to Russians, we don't know. But yeah, they've invested their money in kind of high profile things, right? Something like Chelsea has a huge fan following. This is a way of laundering your reputation for sure.
How do you do that, though? How do you say that you're going to try to do something sympathetic to the people in Ukraine and still at the same time stay on Putin's good side?
Yeah, this is a very big question. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret what has come out of Abramovich this week. And in fact, I was just reading something this morning, trying to get some clarity, a Guardian article, trying to get some clarity from him on what he meant by it. And his team hasn't actually said, because as Alex has pointed out, there is a kind of publicity team around all of this as well, and they're in full-on damage control mode right now.
Alex, you want to follow up on that? How do you stay on Putin's good side and yet try to score those PR points by saying you're going to do well for Ukraine?
Well, I think we've gotten to the stage that, Putin doesn't really care anymore about these public statements of these oligarchs. We had Deripaska come out with a statement saying he wanted peace. The detachment of accountability of this circle of even the powerful oligarchs. We're in this. We're to the stage where this is only Vladimir Putin's war of choice right now. And so I think actually there is a little wiggle room. But that's very self-serving, right? Abramovich is making this gesture because he's been tainted with this now in the public spotlight. The same with the others. So I don't think that's particularly the dilemma. One other dimension I want to mention here, Steve, is that the oligarchs do not handle their own PR. They also outsource this to another type of enabler, reputation management companies. And they have been extremely effective, not only in promoting them, but stopping and intimidating journalists, academics, anyone who would want to investigate their networks, their origins, and their dealings. And so this is another part of this whole apparatus.
Bill, I'm wondering whether loyalty has its limits at a certain point. And by that I mean, We've seen over the last week the U.S. government has decided to do what it's called klepto capture. They're going after, in President Biden's words, a bit of a malapropism, but they're ill-begotten gains.
Right.
Has the attempt by the United States government and other institutions around the world to put the squeeze on these folks, do you think it's made any difference at all so far?
It's definitely made a difference to them and to everybody and to Putin himself. I mean, if you look at Putin's reaction to different things that have happened, it wasn't until he said that Putin then started threatening nuclear war. Why is Putin so upset about the attack on the oligarchs? Because they hold his money. And so the attack on the oligarchs is an attack on him, a specific financial attack on him. It's like if you're playing a game of Battleship, you know, we keep on trying to hit something. We got a direct hit when we went after the oligarchs. It's very important, coming back to our original part of the conversation, that the attack on the oligarchs is not, we're hoping to get the oligarchs to overthrow him. That's never going to happen. They're so scared of him, it's not even funny. The attack on the oligarchs is to attack Putin's offshore wealth and their offshore wealth, because as his central bank reserves are frozen, as other financial flows are being dried up, he's going to look for any place he can to get money to continue this war effort. And he's going to take his money and he's going to take their money, and we shouldn't allow him to have that.
Let me follow up with Christy on something you just said there. Can you imagine a world, Christy, where the squeeze is so tight on these oligarchs that they actually turn on Putin and help in some way, shape, or form to depose him?
I tend to be rather cynical on that score, to be honest. I think, you know, especially since they've hedged against this scenario in some ways too. They have second passports. They have rainy day plans too.
Alex, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you take Abramovich, for example, he was just awarded a Portuguese passport. So he has an EU citizenship, and he has all those rights of living in the European Union. And of course, there is some hedging that has gone on. You know, there's also a question of family members. You know, one of the interesting developments of this round of sanctions is that family members of the oligarchs are also being targeted, and their ability to study, to work in the West. So that's an interesting innovation and development. Whether that increases the pressure on them to a much greater degree to get them to switch sides is still an open question.
Alex, I don't mean this question to sound as naive as it might, but how does a Russian oligarch get a Portuguese passport?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It happens because most of the countries, the OECD and the West, started these actual passports for sales or residency for sales. Most of them had them and then expanded them after the great financial crisis of 2008 as a way of gaining investment. Take the UK's a scheme that came in 2008 in exchange for £2 million investment. You could get British residency for 5 years, then put yourself into a passport and citizenship queue. Well, the problem is we reviewed the data with some researchers. Between 2008 and 2013, out of the 1,600 Tier 1 golden visas that were awarded, half of them were to Chinese and Russian nationals, a quarter each. So it seems that these are being taken advantage of countries that are threatening to the West, that are rivals to the West. And this is a way for them to gain access, again, to that safety for themselves, their families, and their assets.
Bill, why would our governments do that?
Well, it's simple greed, as he said. As Alex said, they're £2 million is, you know, real money, and they like this flow of money coming in. Nobody was asking any questions. Everybody was just assuming that you know, again, with the help of these enablers, these PR firms, everyone was assuming, look, there's this nice charitable Russian man, and he's put $2 million down. And in fact, you get an even faster track if you do 5 million and 10 million pounds. And so it was all like, you know, kind of a bazaar, really. You know, for the right amount of money, you could do almost anything. And what none of these government officials who put these programs in place realized is that they were effectively selling their national security. And so now we have a bunch of these Russians who got citizenship this way, who then started donating money to various political parties. And so, I mean, you know, people who are in partnership with people on the sanctions list donated millions of pounds to the current government Conservative Party. And so it's kind of an absurd, easy to put together notion of how Russia has been able to infiltrate our societies and our politics, playing by our rules.
Tell me, though, that spigot has surely been turned off now, hasn't it?
Absolutely. It's over, finished. I mean, everybody understands that we're facing a true existential crisis right now. And if we don't do something, if we don't continue to do things that to contain Vladimir Putin, then we're all finished.
Christy, I don't like to spend a lot of time on this program speculating about the future because the state of play changes so quickly all the time. But having said that, I've been asked by viewers numerous times, where does this all go? How does this all end? How do we get a handle on what the oligarchs are doing and have done? I'm sure you've thought of that as well. What does your crystal ball show?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian. I'm the worst person to ask about speculation. I look backwards in the other direction, let's put it like that. But I think we might see some of them sort of, jumping from the ship. We might see that happen. We might see some of them tightening around Putin. We might see some of them hunkering down. I think it's too soon to tell exactly what's going to happen, but I think that they're having very hard conversations amongst themselves right now.
Alex, what do you see?
I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. What we need to do is to keep publicizing the extent of these massive holdings, whether it's their real estate, whether it's their charitable donations, the kinds of passports and citizenships that they and their families own. When we know the full extent of these, then they will also be in a more vulnerable position politically.
Bill, what say you?
Well, first of all, we've only sanctioned about a dozen of the oligarchs, and as you mentioned, there's 118 of them, and so there's a lot more to be sanctioned before we're through with this. I think there's political will now to do it. I think that different governments are sort of dragging their feet because they want to make sure their files are in order. But I suspect that as we watch these horrific images on our television, and as Putin escalates this war, which he's clearly going to do, there's going to be a lot more oligarchs sanctioned, and whether they have foreign passports or not. And I think, by the way, they're going to start looking, different countries are going to start reviewing the granting of those passports as well. I know a politician in Portugal who's asking for that to happen in the case of Abramovich, and I'm sure the same thing will be happening in the case of all the golden visa passports that have been issued here. And so I imagine they're all going to sort of quickly retreat back to home base and regroup and try to figure out what to do, because that's their only true comfort zone, is being at home. I don't think any of them really have the opportunity to go away, because the foreign governments are going to be hostile towards them, and so they're all going to have to go back to Moscow and try to figure out what to do from there.
Do you think the party's finally over?
Yeah, party is definitely over. The wealth of these people has been decimated. Their reputations have been decimated, and now they're just trying to figure out how to survive, put their head down, and hope that they can somehow live through this.
I want to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your expertise on this. Bill Browder, Christy Ironside, Alexander Cooley, it's been great having you on the air. Stay safe, everybody. And again, thanks for your contribution tonight. The idea that the moon landing was faked isn't going to cost anyone his or her life, but widespread misinformation about a once-in-a-century global pandemic could. And in the past 2 years, the spread of false claims, fake news, and outright disinformation has proliferated to such an extent that most of us have encountered at least some of it. With us now on the seriousness of this era of conspiracy theories in Canada, we welcome, in Montreal, Quebec, Taylor Owen, Director of the Centre for Media, Technology and Democracy at McGill University and the host of CG's Big Tech podcast and the new TVO podcast, Screen Time. In the nation's capital, Aaron Kelly, President and CEO of Advanced Symbolics, Inc. And in the provincial capital, Amarnath Amarasingham, Professor in the School of Religion at Queen's University. And we're delighted to welcome you all back to TVO tonight for this rather timely conversation. And Aaron, I'll pick up with you first, because the Freedom Convoy, or Trucker Convoy, whatever you want to call it, only recently was dispersed and disbanded in your city where you're living right now. I wonder what your artificial intelligence algorithm, Polly, has picked up in terms of conspiratorial beliefs in Canada, which may or may not have been influenced by that convoy.
Yeah, it was really interesting. In the convoy, when it came to Ottawa, engaged a large sector of the population, not just in Ottawa, but across the country. And what Polly noticed was that the people who traditionally she would see in the center on the political spectrum started to engage very much with people who are normally on the alt-right. Now, normally these two groups don't intermingle, but because this was an issue that had such wide interest, mandates, the vaccine pandemic, people in the center started to engage with the alt-right and started to look into their conspiracy theories or their misinformation, and started to actually absorb some of these things and repost them. So, for example, the idea that the Prime Minister owns equity stake in some of the mRNA companies, and that's why he is promoting vaccines so much, that started to seep into the mainstream. And so then we saw conspiracy theories toward the government and the belief that the government was corrupt increase. And
just for the record, there's no evidence that that's the case, yes?
That's right. That's been investigated, and absolutely, the Trudeau Foundation does not own any equity in these mRNA technology companies.
Now, these thoughts often appear at the fringes and at the extremes of political thought, but are you suggesting here that Polly is picking up that people in the center are not just being exposed to it, but actually are believing it as well?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea, we saw that the belief that the government was corrupt really shot up during that whole period in the beginning of 2022. Not only did it shoot up, but for the first time in the 3 years that we've been monitoring this, Canadians were more likely to believe that their government was corrupt than Americans. We actually overtook the Americans in this belief. Now, in large part, that's because the belief that the government is corrupt in the U.S. has really fallen since Biden was elected. So it's a combination of that belief is going down in the U.S., but it's really going up in Canada. And so that's why we became very concerned about this, because it was the first time in 3 years that we've seen that Canadians believe that more than Americans.
And this is not just dissatisfaction with government. This is out and out, we believe government is corrupt.
Yes, that there's a conspiracy that the elite is purposely trying to keep down the population, pull the wool over their eyes, that they are profiting financially from the pandemic. Those beliefs increased in the beginning of 2022 among Canadians.
Okay. Ambernath, your job is to sort of survey and monitor all of this. Do you think there is a thread that links all of these different conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I mean, we know from decades of research that moments of crisis always kind of lead to conspiracy theories of some sort, right? So 9/11, JFK assassination, a lot of the UFO-related conspiracy theories that we've seen in the 90s and so on, and pandemics, right? And so the pandemic was going to give rise to conspiracy theories. That was kind of a given, because a lot of what scholars talk about with relation to proportionality bias, I think, plays out here, that a big event must have a big cause of some kind, right? That a bunch of guys with box cutters couldn't have brought down, couldn't have brought America to its knees. A guy in the book depository couldn't have assassinated a living president, and so on. And so this idea that random or large events must have equally large causes, I think, drives a lot of these kind of distrust and conspiracy theories that we've seen. With the pandemic, though, I think it arrived at a time when there were already a perfect storm of factors related to kind of misinformation that was present, particularly in the United States. And so you had obviously the Trump administration slowly eroding trust in science and trust in journalism, trust in public health since he was elected, a kind of a full frontal assault on fact-based reality from the very beginning. It was also a time when social media platforms were having a hard time dealing with this rapid influx of information and at the speed and scale that it was happening, not to mention the alternative social media platforms like Telegram, Gab, Parler, etc., where there was entirely kind of closed ecosystems of thought around some of these belief systems. You also had, of course, Russian troll armies amplifying and further pushing some of these points of polarization and making them worse. In addition to all that, you had the traditional media, Fox News, Rebel News, talk radio led by Rush Limbaugh and others. And you put all that together, and what you had was kind of COVID conspiracy theories go through the roof, and a lot of these other movements, anti-government movements, militia movements, populist movements, QAnon, all started also pushing COVID conspiracy theories, and they all saw their numbers grow. They all saw their engagement grow over time. And so anyone who was basically talking COVID conspiracy theories also benefited from this kind of unprecedented moment in human history. And so anyone who kind of latched onto that COVID conspiracy star also saw their numbers grow.
Taylor, let me pick up on the COVID angle. Do you think that given this once-in-a-century global pandemic, it has also contributed to sort of weaving together many of these disparate conspiracy theories into just a toxic stew, if you like?
I mean, in our work, we've certainly seen the dynamic around mis and disinformation in Canada. I think it's important to see conspiracy theories, including COVID conspiracy theories, as part of a broader challenge of mis and disinformation, with, on the sharpest end, disinformation being false information knowingly shared with the intent of doing harm. So that's kind of the harshest aspect of this. But there's a broader spectrum, right, of just false information circulating through our society that may have some negative effects on the way we behave, interact with each other. But we in our work have really seen a difference between the two elections that we've looked at in Canada, the last two elections, and the suspicion, I think, that a lot of people had that there was going to be a lot of mis and disinformation in that election, like there was in the US. But we didn't see a huge amount, or a huge amount having a large impact, compared to COVID, where we did see a lot of COVID misinformation flowing through Canadian society, and more importantly, that mis and disinformation having an effect on our behavior. So the more we consumed it, the less likely we were to abide by public health guidance, which is a real problem in a pandemic when you need everybody to behave together. And I think the core difference here is that mis and disinformation needs both a supply and a demand. And of course, we have a similar demand in Canada to these kinds of things as in the US. I mean, we're no different to being susceptible to this kind of false information. But with elections, there just wasn't enough supply. There weren't enough people who wanted to spread this kind of content during an election. Whereas now with COVID, because of the American market and our proximity to it, there was a huge financial incentive for people to create this supply of mis and disinformation and conspiracy theories around COVID. And because we're so connected, that seeped in through what we call in our work misinformation pathways into the Canadian market. So you had the demand clearly was already there, but you also now had this huge influx of supply of false information around COVID that ended up in our ecosystem.
Aaron, I don't want to overstate this. I don't want to be overly dramatic, but do you think that we are somehow entering a new era of conspiracy theories in this country?
Yes, I do. And we're seeing that in the numbers, that it is rising. And it really is linked to this loss of power that people feel. They feel a loss of power politically, in large part because of the measures that were put in place because of the pandemic. Some people lost their livelihood. So as people start to feel that they lose power, that they're not represented in the media, they're not represented in government, and also we're finding with educational institutions a loss of trust in these three institutions, political, media, and education, people feel threatened. And as they feel threatened, their belief in conspiracy theories rises.
Amarnath, I want to pick up on something that I think needs some explanation here, and that is, I'm sure many of us can have genuine empathy for people who have a traumatic event happen in their lives, they lose a job, they go through a divorce, whatever it is. If something really terrible happens to you, you can fall into a slough of despond, go down a rabbit hole, and be embraced by these conspiracy communities. What I need help better understanding is the motive behind those who knowingly put out false information for the purposes of just being mischievous buggers in society. What prompts that behavior?
I mean, we have to differentiate in this way between misinformation and disinformation, right? Misinformation is the spread of false information without the intent to cause harm. Disinformation is the spread of false information with the intent of causing harm. And I think there are actors, troll farms in other parts of the world. We saw with the trucker convoy that a lot of the content was being pushed by troll farms in Romania, in other parts of the world. And so there are kind of actors who are dedicated to finding points of polarization in the West and trying to push those divisions further, right?
But
trying to make those...
Why? What's the motive?
I think it's a broader campaign of Russian disinformation agents against Western governments, and this quest to kind of make the West kind of eat itself from the inside, right? If they can create chaos, if they can create mistrust, if they can create a populace, a citizenry that doesn't trust its mainstream media, that doesn't trust its public health officials, that thinks their politicians are part of some deep state cabal, satanic cabal sometimes, that is good for their politics, right? Because that means that we'll just continuously eat away at each other, that we won't have a common set of facts, reality-based discussion, and that kind of erodes. And for a democracy to work, you do need a common set of facts that everyone kind of works from and agrees upon. And this kind of transnational misinformation apparatus, I think, is quite powerful. We were worried about it in the last election, but I think with the trucker convoy, with the pandemic, with whatever comes next, we'll have to keep a close eye on how these misinformation agents or disinformation agents actually are able to tug at the fault lines that we know exist in the country, whether it's immigration, whether it's racism and or indigenous politics, that sort of thing.
Okay, but let me jump in and do a follow-up to Taylor here. That's a good explanation for why a foreign government would want to destabilize our democracy here in the West. Taylor, I need some help understanding why anyone who's from Canada, who's in Canada, who is part of the Canadian ecosystem, what's in it for them to purposely disinform, not misinform, but disinform a Canadian audience? What's the motive?
Well, I think so. One incentive is destabilizing our social systems coming from outside. Another big one is just grift, though. Like a lot of mis and disinformation that flows through the system, or particularly disinformation, is to raise money, frankly. I mean, a lot of the COVID misinformation, disinformation we saw was just for that. This was people with websites trying to drive traffic to their Facebook pages or to get ad revenue, whatever it might be, which is why the size of the American market for that kind of conspiracy was so important, because there was enough people to make that financial incentive hold. In terms of in the Canadian context, I mean, look, when people see an alignment with certain forms of division or anger or dissatisfaction with a consensus or an established party or government, that can create a really powerful political incentive. In the media, being angry, as we know, can create a really powerful incentive. On social media, we know that emotional content and content that engages us and makes us angry bubbles to the top and gets more audience and gets amplified. So you can get this synergy between those things. The way content is circulating on social media, the way it's talked about in traditional media, and the way our political actors are starting to legitimize it and normalize it into our politics.
Okay, let me follow up with you on this then, because I've heard you say in the past that we have things in Canada they don't have in the United States. I think you refer to them as circuit breakers. Tell us, first of all, what circuit breakers are, and what do you see in the Canadian context that traditionally is not part of the American scene?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that's really important to note is that I think conspiracy theories and false information, of course, and false beliefs always exist in society, and it in many cases is fringe. And if it remains so, and it remains outside of our broader political and social dynamic, it is much less of a concern. And so simply identifying false information is not sufficient. We need to show, in my view, that it's also causing social or democratic or economic harm. And in the US, it undoubtedly has. And it has because it's not just, they don't just have the presence of this bad content or this false content online, which we clearly do too, but they have two other components. One, they have cable news, which picks up those themes, those more radical themes from the online fringes, and legitimizes them into the populace. So if I see some conspiracy theory on the internet, and then I turn on Fox News that night, and I see a host kind of legitimizing it, right? Like not taking it from the fringe and moving it into my living room. So that's thing one. The second thing they have is political parties who have also grasped on to some of those more fringe ideas because they saw the audience it was getting on cable news and brought it into their politics, normalized it into their democracy and their democratic discourse. And I think until recently, we haven't had those latter two things in Canada. We don't have deeply polarized right-wing media that was picking up these themes in Canada. In fact, Canadians have very high level of trust still in mainstream moderate news. We find in our work 80+% of Canadians have broad trust in the 5 main news organizations in this country. So you don't have a media system legitimizing these fringe views. And until recently, we haven't had a political party picking them up and normalizing them into our politics, into our electoral system.
Well, let me pick up with the pollster on that. Yeah, I want to pick up with the pollster on that because I would think, Aaron, that if you see a rise in conspiracy theories, you theoretically concurrently see a diminution in support for institutions in the country, political, journalistic, whatever. Are you picking that up, or is Pauly picking that up?
Yeah, we're definitely picking that up. And I just want to add something to the question that you asked about what is the incentive for people to spread this disinformation. And one of the big disincentives, or one of the big incentives that we are seeing is this feeling among certain populations, conservative populations in Canada, that they are being left out in the New World Order. And the New World Order is the a liberal view of society where we are opening up the levers of power to include populations that have traditionally been disenfranchised. For example, women, racialized communities. We're getting these people more into positions on boards and power and politics. And some of these conservative groups feel that it has swung to the point where they are being left out. They can no longer get these positions. They're being left out of jobs. They're being penalized. So that is a big driver of the disinformation, misinformation, and the unhappiness. And then we see that translated into a mistrust of these institutions like government and media, where increasingly they feel that their populations are not being heard, are not being invited to participate in the media or in politics or in the boardroom. And so they are forming their own communities, forming their own news networks, if you will, and putting them out on social media and building their own audiences. But it really is this idea of the power shift and being left out that is causing this. And I think if we can find a way to ensure these people that they can be heard, they, of course, if they're going to be heard, that responsibility comes with that. But that really is the crux of it that we're seeing.
Okay, but in terms of your own polling, have you got hard data which suggests that? I mean, we're talking on a legacy media outlet right now, right? TVO, like many other television channels, a legacy television channel. Are you picking up an increase, a decrease in whether people believe what they see and hear on these media?
We definitely see an increase overall. That's the trend line. Now, interestingly enough, more recently with the war in Ukraine, we're seeing a big upshoot again in trust in government. So it really depends on the issue of the day, which is good. It shows that Canadians are ready to come back and believe in their government again. But definitely from January to March, we saw a huge dip in the trust in government, media, educational institutions. And I think if we're not careful, that will come back because overall the trend is that Canadians are losing trust in those institutions.
Understood. Okay, Amarnath, tell me this, and maybe this is too optimistic a theory, but you'll let me know, I'm sure. If some of what we're dealing with right now has been encouraged or exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and if in fact, as we head towards nicer weather, this pandemic maybe becomes endemic or certainly becomes less of a pariah in our lives than it has been over the last 2 years, do we have reason to believe that conspiracy thinking might just be a little less significant going forward? What do you think?
I mean, part of that is true. I think, we have to differentiate between conspiracy theorists and conspiracy theories, right? And conspiracy theories, absolutely, as was just said, kind of are born and disappear with the times and realities on the ground and the politics on the ground. And, with COVID, I think with our very high vaccine rates, as people meet other people that they actually believe and trust on an interpersonal level, when they see that children that they know personally aren't struggling with the vaccine or aren't suffering with the vaccine, some of the particularities of those beliefs will probably disappear. My bigger concern is I think a lot of people were initiated or became attracted to broader conspiratorial thinking that I think will linger with us, right? And so we know that conspiracy theorizing individuals see patterns everywhere. They see evil cabals and sinister plots everywhere. They see hidden clues everywhere from that they can drag from history to the present. And study after study shows that once you believe in one conspiracy theory, you're more likely to believe in many, many others, right? And we know that conspiracy theories and belief in them also have broader societal consequences. You're less likely to vote, obviously, because you believe that the governments are corrupt and are sinister to begin with. You're less likely to volunteer. You're less likely to donate money to NGOs. You're less likely to trust mainstream sources of information. You're less likely to vaccinate your kids, right? And so on and so forth. And so I think the pandemic really mainstreamed a lot of conspiratorial thinking, which I think will be with us for some time because a lot of people felt like the things were out of their control, as was said previously. I think the trucker convoy was a good example of this. It had a long-running impact on people's lives. They lost work, they lost their small businesses, many of their loved ones committed suicide. And so the kind of emotional response to grievances that people had against the government are based in some sort of legitimate grievance. It's just, I think with the kind of perfect storm of factors that I spoke of earlier, we've ended up in a new way of thinking and engaging with information, which I think with the pandemic in the past, with the trucker convoy in the past, will still linger with us going forward.
In our last few minutes here, Taylor, let me get you to pick up the story as it relates to social media. And I wonder whether you think we in Canada have anything to learn from some of the European countries in terms of making Facebook or Twitter more responsible for what's on their platforms. What do you think?
I mean, absolutely. I think, although we've talked a lot about how we may want to better regulate or govern these technologies that largely determine the nature and character of our media ecosystem, we haven't done very much of it yet in this country. And that's likely to change. I think we can learn, particularly from the EU, how to take sort of a structural approach to this problem. I think there's a lot of talk about individual agency in this space, and we do have a lot of it. But we are participants in a larger ecosystem that's embedded with very particular incentives, very particular financial models, that sit much outside of our individual dynamics and participation. And so we need policy solutions that address those, that get at the structural dynamic of the problem. And I worry we haven't had that conversation yet sufficiently in Canada.
Aaron, let's finish up on this. I want to read a quote here from David Aveline, who's a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. And he says the following: I think the way to fight conspiracy theories is to enfranchise people, to not define them as the dregs of society. If you can give people self-worth and give them the sense that they're actually participating and contributing to society, then I think that conspiracy theories will lessen. I mean, that sounds pretty reasonable on the face of it. I like the question that that I have heard you previously ask, which is the notion of to get people out of those rabbit holes. What's the question you like to ask them?
Yeah, I think it's really, you need to bring people into re-enfranchise them, as the professor says, but you have to be careful in how you do it. You don't want to just bring them on and let them say whatever they want to say and not do that fact checking. So what I've seen work when we've investigated this through Poly, through online data, is when you ask people, well, what would make you change your mind? What would convince you, for example, that this vaccine does not contain a microchip? If we were to give it to you and you could take it to your own lab of your choosing and have it analyzed, would that convince you? And then one of two things is going to happen. They're going to say yes, and then fantastic, or they'll say no, nothing you say will ever convince me. Either way, it's a win in a sense, because a person who says I will never be convinced is not reasonable, and they're not going to win over reasonable people. And if they can be, made to look at proof and to consider proof and logic, then that's a win for everybody. So I think instead of putting these people off to the side, as sometimes we tend to do and call them fringe elements, we need to bring them in, but make them responsible for the things that they're saying. And I liken it to a political party that's in power versus a political party that's in the opposition. When you're in the opposition, you can say anything because you're not held accountable. But once you form government, now you're accountable, so your attitude changes. And I think that's what we have to do here, is bring that accountability to these people.
A lot of wisdom in tonight's program. I want to thank the three of you for joining us here on TVO tonight. From left to right on my screen, Amarnath Amarasingham, Aaron Kelly, Taylor Owen. Great to have you on TVO. Be well, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, March the 9th, 2022. Election Day in Ontario is fast approaching. Tomorrow, how parties write the platforms they hope will woo you, the electorate. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.